Professor Murthy, Vice Chancellor, faculty, senior deans, friends. It's a real pleasure to come into the university when you just see this sprouting. And then you come back maybe 5, 10, 20 years later, and then it's a bustling campus. We hope that COVID let us make it bustling. Because so many things have changed in the last 1.5 years. I'm just looking for words to describe, to talk about something that all of you must have been thinking for so long. That we are all at the cusp of change. A change whose magnitude, I think, I'm not sure many of us even internalize. And for me, it was a very funny way in which I was forced to think about this. And that's why when Professor Murthy asked me if I want to talk, I thought I should talk about the future readiness. How do you really even decide what is readiness? Is it just buildings? Is it just faculty? And then is that being ready? And how do you even decide the future? I think it's audacious to even consider any of us can predict what kind of future is going to emerge. COVID has taught us. COVID has been a beautiful experience. As a physician, I can't say beautiful, I can say painful also. We've lost a lot of colleagues, friends. In my own organizations, I've lost 14 people. So it's not easy to say beautiful. I say beautiful from many, many different ways of looking at that word. The first thing is, for the first time, man has been shown his place. In a very simple way, if I were to say, they've been clearly, our vulnerabilities have been exposed, inadequacies of human attainment has been demonstrated, our own incompetence has been clearly established, and more importantly, our greed, our mismanagement, and the misapplication of science and technology has been very clearly shown to all of us. I think this world has demonstrated what we're all going through is possibly the result of what what he thought might have been a control. But the point I'm trying to make is we have created a world, the complexity of which we are contributing to every day, that we are not understanding that we also need to create a world which can make it simpler than what it is today. And I say this because for once we were shown that no single discipline can claim any kind of competence to help the world move. With last generations, the generation of computers and computer scientists, the last year has been for the first time a demonstration of sciences need to converge. Even amongst the medical sciences, if you watch television, I stopped watching it because I think it's just an insult to human intelligence nowadays. Everybody was an expert on coronavirus. From IAS officer to cardiologist to cardiothoracic surgeon, anybody wants to be an expert, it can be overnight. All you have to do is remove a few television anchors and to sit there 7 to 7:30. I actually logged this a few days ago for my students. It's fascinating. IAS officer, you will be fascinated. 7 to 7:30, somebody is an expert on gender issues. And then he goes to the other channel, he suddenly becomes an expert on archaeology. and then it's on foreign affairs, on Afghanistan. And 9 o'clock news is again corona. So you're confused. How can this guy know so much of so many things? And then, which can understand and exploit this and build on this, are the ones that are going to thrive in the future. So I was very happy when I received Murthy's first letter showing these are the dreams, these are the schools that are going to come up. I was actually thrilled that you actually think of a School of Humanities. Because the world for so long has considered shutting down BA and MA and all these courses. In the last 20 years, at least, I've been part of so many discussions, both in government and outside, where people think that humanities is useless. I think the university is a little too late in happening. That's my only complaint. Should have started this 20 years ago. Maybe India would have been better for that. So how do we really look at future readiness? We can't talk about the future. The incident I want to narrate is when at Cornell, I was trying to push them to start a School of Public Policy. So I felt it's important. A university of that nature, a land grant university in the United States, possibly known for its veterinary school, its agriculture school, its School of Hospitality, Statler School of Hospitality. and they were looking at all of them were considered to be number one in their own spaces, and they didn't have a school of public policy. So I was trying to ask them why, and they said no, we don't see a future in that. That is how the discussion began. And this year they're actually starting it, so that means the future must be happening in their lives. But I raised this because during those discussions, after the discussions, we're walking back. The dean of the school I parented with, Industrial Labour Relations School, the ILR school for the college. We were walking back together, and he said, I think I'm going to have a meeting of all our faculty, and I want you to also come and I want to re-explore what we are teaching. Very casual statement. So all of us, then we got a small little memo, and we all went there with us, curriculum and all this stuff. And he said, I want to ask all of you, what are you teaching? Each one, I said, I'm teaching a course on leadership, I teach a course on sustainable development. And each one sets up. And obviously, in the Industrial Labour Relations School, we talk to human resource, organizational development, organizational behavior, and economic process economics. And then he said, if you are a student sitting in any other course that you all are describing, and you get out 4 years later, you come in as a freshman and then as a senior you get out, how many of you would actually employ those skills? So your courses are being taught today for a student possibly who is going to graduate 4 years with you. And are we even teaching them something that is going to be relevant in the job space 4 years from now? And so that's when they coined the slogan, understanding the future of work. Because if you don't understand the future of work, I think the university is pretty much useless. Because whether you and I like it or not, we can talk till the cows come home and say education is for awareness, all that is nice in seminars. Let me tell you the reality of life. Education not linked to employment, the university will go bankrupt. That's the truth, and we better come to terms with that. Every one of us in this room are where we are today because of the education we have. Every one of us want our children to go to schools and colleges and universities because we think that they'll finally end up with a good life and because they'll get employed. So why are we trying to act as though, use all these nice fashionable statements? I used to have this discussion with Dr. Kasturirangan and tell him, the NEP, why don't we come to terms with it and say, finally, why are we creating this dichotomy and say education is for human awareness? All that's nice, but end of the day, given a choice, people want jobs, people want employment. And so any future thinking work not linked to the future of work itself, I think is a wrong way to begin the argument. That's my view. I'm not saying you should agree with it. You may completely discard this view, but this is my view. I'm not saying education is not relevant to other things. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying if you want a viable educational institution which enhances and enables opportunities for employment, then your chances of survival in the market is higher. And we are realistic about the ecosystem. You cannot simply imagine an ideological ecosystem that doesn't exist and then try to embed your institution inside that. We'll have to be realistic and say, in the reality of the situation, how can I still be ideologically aligned and firm on what I believe in? So I would reframe it that way. So I was thinking about this question and I asked myself, the leadership course I teach, is it of any relevance or use when a student comes out? Is it of any real utilization value for him and how does he shape his life? And I came across and as I started doing my research to reform my syllabus, I came across a very interesting, I started looking at how the future of work is going to look like. And a report called Mega Trends, I think many of you might have seen it, though I don't like consulting agencies, but some of their work is brilliant. So I looked at this report and 3 things stood out for me and what I gleaned out of it. And that's where I want to begin as you start conceiving all the great work that you're going to start doing. 3 things which they said, and that report was very hard and ruthless in its expression. It spoke about 2020, I think it was 2015 when I read it, so 2020, 5 years ago. I'm sure the report will be trash if you look at post-COVID. But I think it's an important way of thinking, and that thinking is what I want to present to you. It spoke about, by 2020, the report said jobs as we know, I am using the word jobs, I am not using the word work here. So I am making the distinction between the two. They said by 2020 jobs as we know, 75% of the jobs as we know will no longer be the same that they were when they described it in 2015. So without even changing the description, the job would have changed by 2020. 75% of jobs as we know it would have been irrelevant or no longer necessary by 2020. That was their estimation. Now, I've been talking to a few researchers who are involved in that and asking them, did they ever go back and verify how many of them actually will disappear? These are projections. All of us know when we make predictive analysis, we all make it based on historical data. It is completely altered in the last 2 years. The data is completely new to all of us and we really don't know how it's going to throw. But the point I'm trying to make is not the data. Let us look at 3 things stood out for me. And I think that's something which has not altered and are fundamentally still relevant today. The first thing that said is, if your students or those entering the job market, the report said about what kind of skills and abilities that CEOs around the world look for when they recruit. So that's what you're training them for finally, right? You're all building them up for, you want campus interviews, the universe are judged based on that, your market judges you, I'm not talking the rankings, the market judges you based on how many students go where, what is the salary they get, we can all keep arguing about it, but that's the reality which students are judging you also. So if you look at the whole context, and parents are judging you that because they are the ones who are spending the money finally in the context of India. So there I found that one of the things they said was the first quality which is going to be priceless is your ability to disrupt. And imagine yourself, you're running a university, you're going to run a university which is going to get children at the 18 years of age, 17, 18 years of age, undergrad level and maybe 21, 22, and maybe in the work, changing world, older people having in for masters or doctoral work. We have all grown up in a system where compliance was the norm. In Kannada, we have this, how many of you know Kannada? Kai cut pai muchu. Typical, fold your hands, keep it out. You can't speak, you can't even answer back to your teachers. So we have grown up in ecosystems where questioning is not seen as a priceless commodity. It is seen as a problem commodity. So we have grown in an ecosystem where we are told that the good student means you ask any, and I can challenge even today. I go extensively travel across India, I go to government schools, I ask the teachers, who do you call a good student? You ask them to describe it. You try this acid test on anybody across the country. And mostly urban schools are changing now, rapidly changing. But I'm talking rural schools where the context is really more palpable. They would say the one who sits quietly, one who listens to whatever they say, one who comes organized to class, one who does their homework. If you say everything, it's always compliance. They will never say one who jumps around with joy, one who plays around, jumps climbs on a tree, takes all his friends in great karate in their class, makes fun of the teacher. Those are all things looked down upon without even understanding. If you actually dissect out from behavioral science perspectives, disruption is a priceless commodity which very few people carry into other lives. Because society makes sure they comply. Because we are all the time designing systems to enable conformation and conforming behaviors rather than enabling lateral thinking, disruptive thinkers. And today, tomorrow's future is going to be in the hands of young people who are going to become disruptive innovators. Disruption is not destruction. And that's the problem I find a lot of faculty people, when I talk to them, they get troubled by what I say because they equate disruption to destruction. Disruption is constructive, whereas destruction is not. Disruption replaces the old with something better, something newer, and something very adventurous and risky. So disruptors have to be risky, they have to be adventurous, they have to be completely different kind of thinkers. Now, how many of us actually focus when we write a curriculum to actually get disruption into a classroom? We don't even design a disruptive classroom. If you look at even a class, and this is what I would request all of you, your classroom should start telling a story which is different. Your classroom should have a disruptive design. Why do you want a classroom with benches and chairs? This is a very hierarchical mode of learning teaching. I am standing here and I am expected to deliver some gyan and all of you, some intelligent people in this room. If I calculate the average age of experiences that the room has got, it will be for 5 times my age. And here I am, I know some stuff, I'm talking to all of you, and we all do pretend this in the classroom, right? We all stand hierarchically superior. It's one to many kind of a situation that we promote. No, disruptive classrooms are not going to be like that. A disruptive classroom, there's not even going to be a teacher or a professor anymore. Can we design that? That's a future ready university. We are only going to be a facilitator of learning. We are going to be a co-creator of knowledge with our students and not a provider of knowledge or not. Now, if you're going to be a teacher, I think that's not, you're the wrong person for a future ready university. But if you come in here as a learner, I think you are the right person. Because you are the one who's going to struggle to find out what your 20-year-old needs. Because you can never know. You're fossilized. Let's not come to terms. I am fossilized. We're all fossilized in our own ways because the brain and the concretized pathways that we have all evolved over the last 40, 50, 60 years of our lives make us see things in particular ways, make us filter things in particular ways, make us carry our own baggages, whether we like it or not, we want it or not. It's extremely difficult to throw it away. But then a 20-year-old comes with very little baggage. And if you want him to comply and simply imitate you, why come to a university for it? Right? You can get it elsewhere. So disruption is such a priceless commodity. And I don't know how to, I'll possibly talk a few ideas later. The second thing, and disruption is connected to innovation. I'm not going to separate it. So disruptive innovators are going to be the norm. And are we capable of creating a disruptive innovator? Then you already answered the question, we are a future ready university to some extent. The second quality which people are going to look for, and even youngsters are looking for this. Today, I know my father's generation, possibly he was a central government employee, the greatest attainment for him could have been to get a government job. And then he's happy. That's ultimate in. And from this little village in Tamil Nadu somewhere, he came up and then hard heavy food to eat, and he used to tell me the stories. And finally gets a job posted to Bangalore. His life is done. Everybody is jealous of him. He's got a government job. His salary is 160 rupees. That he'll not tell anybody. But government job, right? But then things slow time came. And my generation itself, I said, what the hell? I'm going to walk away from all this. So I just went and lived in the forest. I had fun. I had great fun actually. I've been beaten up, I've been arrested. That's why the human rights commission. So that's how I actually went to them, because my rights are completely violated by the state. But I had the courage and the conviction to say I live my life the way I want. Thankfully, schooling didn't interfere with my education. But then look at current generation. My son, he went into Indians of Science, and the second year he told me this institution has got nothing to give me. I was nervous with all this talking. I was telling him, you know what? Do something. Finish a damn degree at least there. The cosmetic value of a degree is priceless also, especially in IISc. He said, no, I wanted him to take a year off after his second PUC. I said, just travel from, live in the villages. I'll give you, I have saved 1 lakh rupees. I'll give you the 1 lakh to you. Go around for a year, have fun. And then if you want to study further, study. At that time, he didn't take it off. He went and took up his KVP exams and went into Indians of Science. And after 1 year, he said, this doesn't have anything to offer. I said, now it's too late. The 1 lakh is spent, so you better go back and finish your education. But I'm saying this because last year he simply walked off. And he set up his own company. And I asked him why. And his convictions are very clear. He says the whole world is screwed up. Nobody understands the word privacy anymore. But people think they've all given up. So they think that it's no longer attainable for anybody. I want to design a communication platform which protects your privacy, keeps you anonymous, at the same time ensures that you can, it's relative anonymity. Now I don't understand most of it. And he works on AI and ML and all that. I only simply nod my head to pretend to show that I understand. Because you can't tell your son you're an idiot. At least tell him that you're reasonably better for, and he should not lose faith in the father, right? So you've got to shake hands. I'm saying this example because, the next quality, you've got to think differently. And you can't think differently if you come from a system which makes you conform. You've got to be different. And then today, 2 days ago, I was talking to him. He said, I asked him, what is it that gave you the ability to do all this? Apart from his primary education, around schooling methods. He went back and for the first time he told me it's the Indians of Science. And I asked him, what in IISc can you pick 2-3 qualities in IISc which makes you feel that they gave you this courage, that you could just do what you wanted in life? And one was humanities, the integration of humanities into the education. You have no choice. You go to IITs and IIScs today, you have no choice. You have to study humanities. At that time, he used to crib and criticize and said, why do we have to study? Pure science people have to study. But today he said, it showed me that there's a world beyond science. And I thought that is also such a priceless thing. Maybe Indians of science itself is not aware. It is teaching, because they want to teach the children only world of science. But somehow somebody, some director sometime must have thought about it. And he said, from there I understood that there is a world outside our labs and there's a world outside. And so I was exploring what can we do. The second thing he said, it's a very negative statement. He said, we're getting us to focus only on science. I was wondering what else IIS is missing, and I realized that missing and how to apply science they never taught us. So I realized that what I'm going to learn is only how to apply what I'm doing, because this I can't get here. And once I realized, I thought this institution has no relevance to me because I want to apply. And application is not what they're teaching. So he just didn't complete his master's program, he just left and came home. Because he said that courage to take a decision, where does it come from? And I described it in the Megatrends report also. I use my son as an anecdotal example. It could be hundreds of thousands of young people out there. Many of you might even be knowing, or many of them might be in your own families. The second quality is today, if you don't understand the world of digital and data, it doesn't matter which sciences you are in. You can be in humanities, you can be in engineering, you can be in computer sciences. But a world where you don't understand the world of digitalization, the digital space, we might look at Facebook and WhatsApp and all this meaningless nonsense of children indulging when they're 8 or 9 or 10. But those are the instruments of change, and they are going to be the instruments of education of the future. And the more faster we come to terms with how do we exploit it for education, the better it is for us. I remember 5-6 years ago in my own class, I told my students, you know how American universities are, they're also student-centric. The student complains, the professor will do the job. That's how it operates, right? Everything is around them. It's not about what you teach, it's about how the students think you teach. That is what is more important to them. And so you have to be very careful of any statement you make. Nowadays you got to be so careful of the pronouns you use also. It's such a problem for me. I can't even remember what pronoun to use for it. And those are political correct things that you have to maintain. And the laptop usage is a challenge. Because I know what my students are doing. If you're walking around the classroom, some of the last benches are on eBay or on Amazon and watching the shoes and watching what dress to buy and all that. Every student does it. So how do you get them to stop using a laptop or a smartphone in class? And anytime you ask a student, they'll say they're taking notes on a laptop or they're writing on a stylus on a phone. So you can't tell them you don't do anything. But you can always tell them what you want them to do. That is funny. I realized the secret of managing American administrators in the university is not to use a negative in whatever you tell students, and then everybody is happy. But you can go a little more intelligent in your communication. So I told my students, I welcome laptops and smartphones in my class. I welcome that because I hope all of you take down a few things that you learned in my class. And your participation grade is assured. If within 10 minutes after class, you send me 10 points. I am very sure I have said 10 points in the class. I am so perfect in my teaching. I have set up 20 points. I am only asking you to give 10. Within 10 minutes you send, you will get 100% participation rate. And you will not see a single laptop or smartphone in my class. So why waste? If laptop is open, you're taking notes. That's why I said my way of understanding a student's participation is, if your laptop is open, you participate. Otherwise you have to talk. The only two ways they can gain participation. So either you talk or you write. But the fact is, would I say that today in a classroom? Would I look down on a student actually negotiating his way through a social media tool that is available? How would I even talk to a public policy student who in my days of studying, learned predictive analysis based on historical data? Today we teach our students what Cambridge Analytica did. And we tell them how to shape human behaviors based on Facebook likes. There's a 95% certainty that if I look at the last 20 likes that you put on Facebook, I can actually predict what kind of decision making you're going to do in the next 6 months or 1 year. I can actually force you to vote for me if I stand for an election by just looking at your Facebook data. And we don't even think of it, but an youngster will tell you how to do it. We have algorithms that are so complex. When Britain underwent the Brexit cycle, 49% of the people who voted for Brexit did not even know what the hell Brexit was. But they were made to believe that it's good for my country. So they could actually tap into a very subtle, nuanced feeling of patriotism and say, I don't know why I'm saying yes to Brexit, but if they say yes to Brexit, my country will improve. And people actually shaped their opinion, and Cambridge Analytica was actually commissioned by the set of politicians, the lobbying force who wanted Brexit. And these are realities of today. And these are done by youngsters. And people who manage digital and data are the ones who are going to shape the world's future. And we better come to terms with it. And so if you're starting a school of data sciences, I think you are, right?
Yeah.
I think you're already nearly there. And the last is something fascinating. It's my area, that's why I liked it. I liked it. Is what is going to shape the world is everybody cannot master data and digital spaces. We can't be experts in that. Everybody cannot have the ability to be risky and adventurous, to be a disruptive, innovative. But we can get very intelligent people who know how to manage these two people. And that is where leadership is a critical thing. So the ability to lead not just the other two sectors, the innovators and the disruptors and the digital space and data space experts, but ability to lead yourself. So leadership is no longer about others around you. That's management, sir. But it's about how you look at yourself, and that is where I think Indian universities can teach the rest of this world a lesson or two. Because we have been imitating the West. It's time for us to shed aside in an upcoming university like yours, especially with background RLB and the RSST, set up for rational values, should create a unique model, something very different, something driven by the Indian ethos and civilizational structure. And I'll explain to you why. My last 10 years of research shows that the greatest contribution India has done, and we never recognize it. If you look at the report of, his name is not connected to me, the World Millennial Economy Report, was it called? State of the World, it's the Millennium or something like that, where he studied 2000 years of economic history of the world, the British economic historian. He just passed away a couple of years ago. And his study shows the first 1600 years of recorded post-Christ history, India is the only nation which sustainably grew without falling back in the economy. Right? 1600 years. And something happened in 1600. Between China and Russia, China and India, two civilizations, we control close to 68% of the global economy. This is not something insignificant. India had 38%, they had 30%. 17th century, something happened. We started slipping. They started still retaining their position. By 18th century, both of us lost the race. By the time we got our independence, the global share of our GDP was less than 2%. Today, we keep talking India at 75. What have we achieved at 75? With a cheap imitation of westernization. But we have lost what we had. Nobody asked the question. Everybody kept writing, I had some discussion with Shashi Tharoor, and he's convinced that colonization destroyed us. Well, it's substantially true, but instead of looking at what flipped the switch in 1600, why don't we look at what kept us going till 1600? So I started my research on what is keeping India going, what kept India going till 1600. Is there something in the 1600 years we can learn? And if you look at it, all human endeavors, great achievements, all this romanticized version of India we get. We discovered zero, we discovered the binary system, we discovered metallurgy, we discovered all kinds of things, we say chemistry, algebra, trigonometry. All that happened in that 1600 years. Post 1600, we didn't have the capacity to make a watch, where HMT had to go get technology from outside, simple watch. We reduced our nation to a pathetic state. But let's look at why we progressed for 1600 years. India progressed because India invested its energies not on creating an economic future, not on $10 trillion, $20 trillion economies that we talk about today, but India invested on people. So India's slogan was building human and social capital. And that's been the basis of my work for the last 8 to 10 years. How do you build human capital? How do you build social capital? And that's where I come to part of the Future Review University. These universities must be centers of building this capital. It looks paradoxical when I started off saying connected to employment and economy, and then coming back and saying build human and social capital. Research evidence conclusively proves if a man's human and social capital is built, he is a creator of economic capital. So you don't have to even worry about employment. Every student who graduates from this institution, if you're focused on building his human and social capital, he will be extraordinary. Because if you look at the three megatrend indicators, you can teach digital sciences, you can teach data sciences, but how are you going to teach a person how to be disruptive? How are you going to teach a person how to innovate? You can't get a code. You can. It is no longer alive today. Clayton Christensen at the business school. I did some teaching at the Kennedy School, so we used to talk a lot during coffee or lunch, and then I would ask him, "You have written so many books on innovation. Can you actually transact it in a classroom?" He said, "It's an experience. If you can create an experience in a classroom, you can teach it. Otherwise, you can only talk about it." It's a very nice way of putting it. So you can talk about the innovation. I can give you a lecture on innovation. But can I create an experience for a student where he's perpetually feeling he's innovating in a classroom? Can you create an innovative classroom space? But for that, you have to be an innovator. We can't keep looking at people to come with PhDs to a classroom. We should look at ability of people who can transact competence in the classroom. So the measurement of how you select a teacher itself will change. I don't know how much of academic freedom universities are going to be given, or they have to follow all the government of Karnataka's standards. I don't know how much of freedom you will have, and you will have the courage to innovate. It's a hell with government. I did that in our schools. To satisfy government, you would have D.Ed, B.Ed and all that. But they can't tell me about others who are going to be actually teaching. You have 10 D.Eds, but you have 20 others who come and teach. And therefore the child gets some benefit. So you can maybe find shortcuts, but I think you should find shortcuts. So this university is going to be different because students are no longer students who are going to come sit in a classroom. COVID has taught them that you can get all the information, maybe better quality information than any professor can give in a classroom. You can get it on Google. That's the reality. You can get it on all the enormous amount of online courses you have. You can go to edX, Coursera, Unacademy, India Excel, so many of them are coming up. They're mushrooming. So content is not going to inspire you. Your professional competence is not going to attract you. There must be something you bring to the classroom where they can never get it anywhere else. And there's two sides of arguments I see. People think a high online education is going to be the future. I don't think so. Online education can provide extraordinary content, but only a human being can create an experience. So I believe the future-ready university is one which masters hybridized versions of teaching, where you will give your student content not in your classroom. And so flipped classrooms, you don't need brick and mortar space. In fact, I get very nervous when government says 25, that's why I asked that question, 25 acres of university. Why the hell you need 25 acres for that experience? You ask the government why, I'm sure the higher education secretary will have no answer. Somebody somewhere, some undersecretary will return 25 acres. Why 25? What do you do? Kennedy School is all of 1.5 acres. Yeah. We don't know how big Harvard is because they are all over the place. At least MIT and the other place we know that one campus. Cornell I know. Cornell we are 18,000 acres. And half their land I don't know where it is. Mostly it's apple orchards. The university proper maybe 300 acres. But rest of it we go for walks and it never ends. Our orchards keep going on, but they make more money in apple than on possibly anything else there. But the point I'm trying to make is why land, why buildings? What you want is an innovative classroom experience. And that's what hybridized versions can be. So students are not going to be satisfied with information. So if you are going to prepare for a class based, a curriculum based on information provision, you got to think a little deeper. I'm not saying information is not important. What they want is an experience of how they process that information, respond to the information, and then reapply that information in real life. So future-ready university has to have future-fit faculty. Because your students are future-ready, future-demanding. They are not going to reduce their demands just because you are not ready. They are going to judge you and say, what life, professor? When they go out, they'll say this and go. I'll tell you, that's how they talk. I can maybe tell that about me also, I don't know. But they know, the moment they know that, because they look for three things. They look for relevance. They look for how you relate. How do you relate to the student, how do you relate to the subject, how do you relate to real life. So something which is absolutely important. So I look at the contextual relevance, cultural appropriateness, and the interconnectedness, the relationship that you can build. If your teaching is missing these three elements, you are not future. Because the student is seeking all this. And the moment you're good at all these three, even if your content is not good enough, student looks for the humility in you to say, I don't know, maybe I can discover it with you, because he'll go back and Google it. Let me tell you this much, when a student comes to me in office hours with questions, he'll tell me, yesterday morning in class you said this, I went back and Googled it, I don't think, I found 4 other ways of describing it, what do you say about it? And you have no idea what he's talking about. So I tell the student, I am very okay with it, because I'm after all a visiting faculty. At best I have other things to do in my forest. The university can say stay at home, I stay at home. I don't do it for the money or anything else. So I tell the student, I don't know much, why don't you teach me? So the moment you have a role reversal, you are future ready. Because today's learning, a 19-year-old actually knows a lot more about life than what you think you do, or what you expect a 19-year-old to do. So are you ready to even listen? So teaching is a wrong word, like I said. So teaching has got a hierarchical provisioning of knowledge. But can you be a listener and role reverse yourself? So this perpetual learner is no longer a concept. It's a mandate for a future ready. Right? Can you learn all the time? There's so many things to learn, I can tell you. Tell yourself, I don't know so many things as youngsters know. How many of you, anytime your smartphone has a problem, go to your son or daughter? See, that means you're already learning. So come to terms with your incompetence. A future ready faculty is very comfortable with their incompetence. Don't gloat over your competence. I am very candid, but that's where I am. People in my part of the country tell me, I feel that we can't lose time anymore. This urgency of the situation is such that we have to repackage ourselves, repurpose ourselves to be an eternal learner. And the best way to deal with that is tell yourself what you don't know. And surprisingly, your students, that's exactly what they know. It could be a movie that got released yesterday. How many of us even care to find out, right? Or the cricket match that India won 2 days ago. Just talk to the youngster, he'll tell you all the statistics. Build your content on that. You'll suddenly see that how relatable it becomes. For him, it becomes life suddenly. You can get such powerful opportunities in classroom discussions by just relating it to it. How many of you ever tried talking about sexual identities in classrooms? Anybody here? The only 3 hands. It's powerful. If you're careful with it, you can connect any subject to it. From biology to psychology to mathematics to statistics to language to mindsets to societal sociology to political economy. You can connect. I've taken on this challenge with a lot of my colleagues. You can virtually connect any subject. Anthropology. You can even connect archaeology. If you go to some of our Belur Halebeedu, you can easily connect all those things. And so suddenly it becomes so relatable to the youngster. And then gently take him away. We all know this, known to the unknown. He knows that. Take him away to the unknown of your subject. And then he loves you. And then he'll say that this is how I should learn. Why did somebody teach me this way? Because he's not seeing the application part of it. Because nobody teaches it the way he wants to apply. Because we see it in the way we think he should be applying. So reframe it. So I think we have to now look at teaching in a different way. And brick and mortar institutions will never lose their relevance. I think this insecurity is a lot of academic universities have been associated with. People are nervous, they've invested thousands of crores. All I tell people is don't keep building to satisfy some law, but build to create an experience. So my request to all of you is not to let your architects design your classrooms. If you can do that. Because architects have an idea, they have studied in architecture school how a classroom should look. So they come from a particular groove, a particular mindset of discovering the classroom. And there will be architects sitting in this room, but I am not hesitant to say that. But can you sit with your students and design a classroom? It's asking a lot, I know, as you're getting new students, but you'll suddenly discover that they have 100 things to offer to you. I have tried it out with tribal children, and I would welcome all of you to come. 20 years after building the school, I thought I did a great job. Suddenly I realized 20 years itself is fossilization today. Today's crop of tribal children don't belong to the 20-year-ago tribal children. They are the children of my children who came to school at that time. And these children are different. They don't have any tribalism in them. as much as the parents had, and their needs are different. So we sat with them and we discovered, we realized 80% of the classroom structure that I have in the school take a lot of effort for a charitable organization to raise money to build the school. But I had the courage to tear down 4 classrooms and said we're going to rebuild it. And we're rebuilding now. Because suddenly the child needs are so completely distinctly different. 20 years is a long time and we still claim credit in building new Varsha in the year. It's a problem, it's not achievement. We should understand it.
While you are there, so Dinesh Verma, yes, architects, is constructing our Ravi University campus is present.
Great. I'm glad he's present here because I'm sure he'll agree with me.
I know what you're saying, it's quite.
So I'm glad he's here because I think this kind of arrangement itself, this itself is hierarchically insulting if you ask me. It automatically puts me on a pedestal and confers on me a value which I don't have and makes me believe I have some competence to share with you and makes you believe that you have to receive the competence. But it gives this feeling, right? And I'm sure the students will feel the same way. So how do we demystify all this, deconstruct all this? I think Future Ready is in 4 domains. So let me quickly conclude. I know I have to finish in 10 minutes. First thing is ask yourself, have you understood the student? A simple question. How do you frame a student as a potential entrant to society who's going to be part of the economic food chain 4 years from today? What is it that he's going to need? What is it it's going to have? Is it aligned to the needs as expressed by many researchers, students, all of them in the space of understanding? They get disruptive innovators, digital and data sciences, and the leadership that I spoke about to manage 3 worlds. Second, can I redefine and reframe the role of a teacher? I don't have a better word, I'm using the word teacher, the same semantic. Can I look at what is it that enables him to be a facilitator of learning and not a provider of information? He could share wisdom, but he should never provide information. It's a dangerous thing. Information it's cheaper to get information from your smartphone than pay 10 lakhs, 15 lakhs to the university to come and take the degrees. So why are we even fooling ourselves? So can I repackage information into a powerful experiential experience? And remember, all your kids are adults. They relate to education differently than children. Children can accept prescriptive teaching. Adults cannot accept it. They demand in their minds at least. That's why the conflicts arise in them. They demand participatory learning. So if you cannot co-create learning with them, you miss the bus. So these children are 18, 19, they're adult learners. Their learning in adults happen today. There's a lot of research. We call it 70, 20, 10. 70 is experiential. Unless you create powerful experiences, learning is not going to be for long. It will be there till they take the examinations and then they say, Mugitapa. You ask the student when he gets out of the examination, Sadhya Mugitu, Naale community medicine, Odade Beda. He's actually happy he's not going to study community medicine without even telling that Naale apply Martin community medicine. How many of them say that? Or maybe in the engineering context, they will Sadhya Mugitapa, set of materials. We have created a world which actually believes that learning is over with examinations. But an experience you create will make them lifelong acquisition of knowledge. They become a sponge waiting to get it. So can you teach them how to learn? I used to run a workshop called Leading to Learn, Learning to Lead for teachers. No, I'm not finding time for it. But how do you learn to lead as a teacher? To lead these experiences? And how do you get your children to learn, to start learning how to learn also? And you have to teach them how to learn, and for that you have to know how to learn. So if you can give them this unique mantra of learning how to learn, that's all you need to do in universities. Because you cannot teach anything else in the university. You can teach them how to learn. And that is where a teacher has to be redefined. You have to invest on faculty. So when you're doing your interviews for Samurti, if you have the courage, don't look at the qualifications, don't look at the degrees. Ask them to teach all of you something uniquely different. Create a learning experience for all of you sitting in this room. And if he creates it, I think you're the right person. And he'll be brilliant in a classroom. I can tell you, the students will love it. How you manage to follow the rules, etc., it's up to you. That's why you're the vice chancellor. I'm only the speaker. And the teacher. I'm using that word because I don't have equivalent word that I can communicate to you. So can you create that kind of a facilitation of knowledge, co-creator of knowledge? But don't forget to share your wisdom. That is priceless. A student can never get that. Packaged wisdom of your 30, 40 years, relating your information gained to the experiences you had in life and the context in which you operated and the results it showed is what your student wants. And that's powerful. And that is why somebody who has not been in the field should never be in a classroom. And look for, I call them academics, people like me who are practitioner academics. And I really like it when you said that you went to the field, because Labasana youth, IIM professor teaching in Labasana is the greatest danger that you can do. But that you went to the field and understood and came back is exactly what you need in faculty today. And if you can do that, you can create practitioner academics. And if you have no choice but to recruit an academic, send him out for 6 months, 1 year to become a practitioner, then come back. And then you realize this class has meaning. The third is the content you teach. Whatever subject you take up, filter your content, and remember, if you are teaching the same thing the next semester, the course might be titled the same, but if your content is the same, then you are already fossilized. 6 months is enough to make you relevant today. COVID has taught us that 6 days is enough. The R factor can change overnight. The mutations can happen significantly differently. Why are all this a puzzle? We don't have any kind of background information to even say what kind of change is going to happen. With that kind of demands, institutions have changed, corporates have changed, public administration has changed, governments have changed. We don't even know what kind of policies to make in today's context. And in that kind of powerful change that the environment is demanding, don't tell me your syllabus can be the same 30, 40 years later. I remember a very powerful story. It's not a story, it actually happened. How many of you have heard of Prabhu Shankar, the great Kannada writer? Those of you from Mysore would have known. Yeah. So we are all from Mysore. He was a very dear friend and used to come and spend a lot of time with me. And one day we were talking, I was teaching the school class children, and then when I came out, he said, "You Pata Martidhyala, Kannada, all of you know Kannada or some of you don't?"
Some of them.
Kannada Kathayagadane Sopsidu. He said, I saw you teaching children, I am very worried, he said. I said, why are you worried? I am enjoying it. He said, that's the problem. You are enjoying it, you never ask the question, are children enjoying it? Right? We all think if I am enjoying it, then everything is perfect. Then he said, when you're teaching, I remembered my Kannada professor in my class in BA. He studied in Mysore University BA. He said, when I was sitting in class, my professor, a very famous professor, I was sleeping, he caught me sleeping. And he shouted at me and said, Yako nidde marta idya? And he said, my answer was, I am sleeping because your class is a nice lullaby. So what else can I do? So he said, Papa, that's very famous professor. So then I had to find some reason. He said, I asked him, Malgidrena Kudatsar, I said. He was a very nice way of talking. He said, what will happen if I sleep? And the professor said, you will not be able to take down my notes. And Prabhu Shankar answered, no sir, I solved the problem long ago. He said, how? Sir, my father also did BA. You were the Kannada professor at that time also. You gave him notes then. ಭಾಳ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬರೆದಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಸರ್ ಇನ್ನೂ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ ನೋಡಿ ಸರ್ ಅವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಏನೂ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ there's no difference between the notes you gave my father and me. So I don't have to waste time, sir. I am the perfect. I do real examinations. And he told me, don't become a teacher like that. Now I tell him, forget 40 years. 4 months make a difference between one semester to the next semester. Things are changing so rapidly. And if you become too comfortable with the curriculum you develop, then I think you better not teach in RV University. You must go somewhere else. If you really want to be future ready, have the courage to challenge yourself. So are we ready for peer reviews of our curriculum? Will each other review and criticize each other and say, I don't think this is relevant. If you're ready for such disruptive thinking in your own institution, I think you're already getting the courage to become future ready. The content becomes so critical. What are my students learning? Where are they learning it from? And don't think content has to come only from one source or a textbook or a reading material or reference. Today, no student, Harvard Business School has done some studies which shows anything more than any packaging which exceeds 3 minutes is no longer teaching material. A video cannot be more than 3 minutes. A quiz cannot be more than 3 minutes to give your students. A reflection note should not take more than 3 minutes to write. A poll that you run in your classroom and debriefing the poll, because there we have a lot of polls that we do in the class, cannot be more than 3 minutes. So if a teacher cannot plan this 1 hour 20-minute session in chunks of 3 minutes, he's lost the students. And so they challenge them. They say every curriculum you should demonstrate to the dean how are you broken it down in 3-minute bits, And if you're not, or your discussion cannot be moved, so you will see a very rapid movement towards the other discussion, from one discussion to another. Because any discussion longer than 3 minutes, students lose interest now. At least half the students' mind is over. Anything more, so they say 3 minute packaging is so critical, and they teach you how to do it in 3 minutes. At least I was privileged to get trained in Kennedy School. I thought, what can they teach me? I'm teaching it other places also. But I realized I never knew the 3 minute rule. I never knew how to stop talking in 3 minutes. How to suddenly shift gears in 3 minutes. And then you can do it. Everybody can do it. It's not rocket science. All of us can do it. So you ask yourself, any video you're watching, what happens to you after 5 minutes of watching? All of us, even the best of videos, your mind is already gone away. You think you're watching. You're watching. But are you recording anything in your mind is a big question. And we all have these experiences. So look at content. And the last point is the transaction methodology. Like I said, 70, 20. 70 is experiential. 20 is relational. They have to learn from each other. Any learning which is not driven by collective learning is not futuristic. Because they know what they need better than what you know. So their questions are going to get framed by what they seek, and their answering each other is also going to be framed what they seek. And remember, every 19-year-old also has got wisdom. His wisdom is maybe 19 years old. Don't discount it. And if you add 20 students in your class, you have 380 years of wisdom already, much higher than yours. So can you, in your own ways, look at creating the transaction methodology where the last 10% is the information you provide. So if you can design a curriculum where 70% is experiential, 20% is driven by the discussions in your classroom, the relational element, and the last 10% is informational, I think we have a powerful mantra for creating a future-ready classroom. And I hope that as we understand and unpack adult learning principles, adults don't learn if they can't apply. You, I, everybody. There is a pressure of application on us, we learn something new. If you have to know how to use your smartphone, you learn it. If you know how to use, I used to hate Stata, but I started a policy thinking. So I used to use SPS before, but then all my researchers use Stata, I never knew how to handle it. And suddenly they now move to R. Now I have to learn R now, Kaltila, so I can't even talk to them because I'm feeling nervous. So there's always something, and that 22-year-old is teaching me art. Well, you have to learn. They know more. You better accept it. You can pretend to know SPS and Stata, but nobody's using it. The generation that is working out there wants free software, which is not a crime. They're all very knowledgeable today. In my generation, you would have pirated software and you're very comfortable with it. Nobody bothered. So you could steal a SPS or Stata without paying for it. But this generation is, why bother? We use a publicly available software and we use R, and they tell you, why don't you buy R? I can't buy Stata for everybody. So obviously I have to learn R. So we are all in that generation. If we don't learn from them, you lose out. So 20% make it relational. 10% is what you want to teach. And if you can crack the code this way. The last is, if at all you need, create the infrastructure for it. And the infrastructure you create should be driven, now that we have used them, should be created which can enable the ambience for that experiential process, enable the ambience for the relational process. Traditional classrooms are 90% information. And they are not even conversation because students are all facing you. They are not facing each other. How can they even talk to each other? Right? So can you change all this? So even your architecture should be sending a narrative of futureness. And then I will tell you, every university in the world will make a beeline to learn from you. And that is a benchmark, real benchmark, not all these ratings and rankings. If every other person says, Nambu Helpodi, I want to learn how you did it, I think you deserve to be called the best university in the world. So I wish in 5 years from now, RV would set up such a great institution. But India desperately needs. We need at least 500 universities in the next 1 year. We cannot meet the demands of knowledge economy if we don't get world-class institutions. World-class, when you say, we always think in a world outside India. I think it's a big problem. Let's create world-class institutions where the world will come to India to learn what classes. Hopefully RV will be there. Thank you all so much.